Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Super License F1 podcast, a very different, very special edition. My name is Rodney.
My name is Zach.
And it's going to be a little bit of a different show this week. We are interrupting our undefeated, is that the right word? Probably not. Our unbroken run of commentary tracks for the Drive to Survive series because, the world's gone to hell in a handbasket, basically. So we've got a bit of a different show ahead. We have some things that we want to talk about, get off our chests, help each other, maybe help you get things off your chest or think through things. And that's just a flag right up front. If you're coming into this hot and ready for another great audio commentary for the Netflix series or expecting the jaunty banter of a Superquiz, you won't be getting any of that today. That will come back in future, probably in a week's time, I would say, unless things get even worse, which is hard to imagine. But Zach, I'll ask you how you've been, but I know how you've been. It's been tough.
Yeah, it's been really tough. I mean, it was already tough with the pandemic. You know, we're already in extreme circumstances, especially in the US and in the UK as well. And, you know, your home and my past home, but still always Australia home for you as well. And everybody's facing different kinds of difficulties all the time. So, you know, the murder of George Floyd in the US was something that has set off, I think, a lot of different groups and a lot of different people in lots of different ways, and is hitting people in lots of different ways. And my personal feeling on this is that it's amazing that this extreme set of circumstances and this singular set of circumstances is really uniting a lot of voices together. And I think that that's probably why we wanted to talk about it a little bit more today, Rod.
Yeah, the point's been made that the worst of the problems might be kicking off in the US, but this has become and is becoming a global problem. At the very least, it's on the minds and is affecting the lives of everyone around the world. Definitely know it's been affecting me. Spent basically the entire weekend trying to follow the developments on Twitter, and then it's hard when we've been working remotely for a few months, and then you remote into to work on the Monday morning call, and people go, "How was your weekend?" You don't have the heart to tell them that you just spent most of it looking at your phone screen in just absolute despair. It's hard. It's hard stuff to deal with. So we're going to just go through some of those kinds of developments. These are the areas that we're going to be talking about for the next little bit. We will bring it back to F1 a little bit later on, but again, completely understand if this is not your kind of thing. If you didn't sign up for this, or if you feel that this isn't what you're about, that's cool. Feel free to join us next time when this is hopefully something that we can put behind us and move on in a productive way from. Zach and I discussed before we started as well that we might just read out a couple of resources, places that people can go to get support or offer support if they want to, covering a few different areas. But obviously, like we say, this mostly affects people in the US, but it is becoming a global thing. But having said that, half the people that listen to the podcast are in the US. So we want them to know as well that this is affecting us as much as, well, not as much as you, but we are feeling it as well. So I've got my list of things that I wanted to acknowledge in front of me, Zach. I don't know if you want to go first or what, but we'll get into these list of resources we've pulled.
Yeah, why don't you go through the list of resources and I'll play off that, and then we can discuss kind of a few other things around it then.
Okay, I wanted to start with a couple of Australian resources, obviously with the Black Lives Matters situation kicking off in the US. It has actually stirred up a debate and some scrutineering, and rightly so, very timely and incredibly needed in this country, about Aboriginal justice and injustice and deaths in custody and all the rest of it. So some places that you can go if you want to actually do something and make a difference. A couple of places you can go if you want to donate are the National Justice Project or a foundation called Bridging the Gap. They deal with Indigenous people's health and education. A couple of mental health resources. If this is all getting a little bit too much for you and you just want a bit of help, you can call Lifeline Australia. If things are hitting crisis point, you can call or reach out to Beyond Blue for a bit more generalized support. If you want to visit the Health Direct website, there is a list of specialized mental health services. So if you have a specific If you need some specific help, like if you want to talk to someone who specializes in youth mental health or veteran helplines or LGBTQ issues or even perinatal anxiety and depression issues, because this is a trigger for all kinds of other issues and you don't need to struggle through them by yourself. There are people out there that can help. If you're not in Australia, if you're maybe in the US, there are some places you can go if you want to just donate money, including places like Campaign Zero, Reclaim the Block, or the old tried and true reliable classics, the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defence Fund. There is also a really good website resource going around, and I only visited it before, but it is really impressive. It's called blacklivesmatters.card, which is CARRD.co. That has resources if you're in Canada as well. Don't want to forget you guys. If you can't donate any money, that's absolutely fine. There is actually a YouTube playlist of videos and you can just watch it or let it play in the background. Any revenue that's raised from those videos being played, the creators are donating to worthy causes. There's a link to that on the Black Lives Matters website as well. Also, if you are planning to go to a protest yourself, which is becoming increasingly likely, you can get resources there for legal aid, treating injuries if you happen to get pepper sprayed or gassed and so on. So this is a good one to keep bookmarked. Again, that is blacklivesmatters.card, CARRD.co.
Wow, that's a comprehensive and really useful set of resources.
I was hoping it would be, yes.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I mean, like you, I spent so much of the weekend like absorbing information, and that's kind of how it feels sometimes, is that I'm just totally passive, that I'm just sitting there just reading and learning and understanding and getting angry and then getting depressed or getting sad and talking with my partner as well, because we're in essentially lockdown like so much of the world, and so there are a few things that you don't even need to introduce the topic of. You can just we just find ourselves saying things out loud and we know immediately what we're talking about, and so much of that was kind of not directed. So when we spoke yesterday and earlier today about what we do on the show, partly I think we're both, I know I personally was trying to react to my own feelings of kind of like maybe impotence, maybe, or just even inspired by a couple of other shows, other podcasts and what other creators and other people with audiences were doing, and turning that into action. One of the podcasts I think I've mentioned on this show before, but Stadio Football, Stadio podcast, I think they just call their episode a talk about racism and then a talk about football. And they were just very clear about we're not going to not talk about this, but then we're going to go talk about football. And they used the opportunity just to kind of work out how they were feeling and kind of use their platform to put out a broader message. So, I think that when you going through all of those resources like you just did then, around kind of different things that people can do in different countries, and that you mentioned that so much of it is affecting the US specifically, and I think the US specific resources are great, and that's why I really like you can donate to Black Lives Matter specifically, and a lot of those resources will go to the US. You can find local chapters in the UK. I know you can donate to there, but if you donate to Black Lives Matter, especially in USD, they'll make sure that money goes to probably Impact Now, which is what a lot of people I think would want their donation to go to, specifically resources that will help immediately. And then I quite like Show Racism the Red Card in the UK, which is more specifically about football, and using football as a platform and footballers as advocates for the fight against racism in sport, and then the fight against racism in society. And I mean, that sport is quite close to my heart as well. So it's a nice overlap there to kind of invest in institutional change, not just to the needs of right now. And if you do have the ability to give to multiple causes, don't feel like you have to pick one that that necessarily summarizes how you feel all in one go. And this isn't necessarily a problem that maybe you can't give today, but maybe next month after your payday you can, or as Rod mentioned, there are other things you can do as well. A lot of people have just been using whatever social media outlet they have to amplify black and minority voices in this circumstance. So I think that there's lots of options for things that you can do, and if you can move past the kind of what I my feelings were like moving past the, I can't really do anything, am I even in the right country to make change? Of course you are. Wherever you are, you can affect change and be a voice for people who are having trouble being heard right now, or all the time even. And it made me have a bit of introspection on, my own country. And I think especially in Australia, it's not easy, but it does happen that we forget our own like systematic problems in our community, and it really hammered home that as well, sort of compounded the impact a little bit, and changed the conversation in my household and in my family and with my friends as well. So I'm glad you brought that up too, Rod. So really, if there's only a few things you can do, it really is that if you can donate, you should. You should have the time to spare to go and educate and learn, and don't put that on other people. You can use Google yourself. You just go on Twitter, you'll find a million resources. And the resources that Rod already mentioned. So take the time to educate yourself, and have those conversations with other people around you. So there's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah, there's a whole heap. And as you're talking, like I had 100 million thoughts. Like remember when Zach stops talking to jump in with this thing, but most of them are gone because I have my memory's a bit frazzled right now. One of the things you mentioned though was about education and educating yourself, and I think that's been a really big one for me. In that, I feel like you see a lot of people who are posting on Twitter or Instagram just a black square, and that's great. People who want to do that, that's great. People who don't want to do that, that's okay too, I think. And I think what's probably even more important, though, than that is to see that as a gesture and understand that it's a gesture. And yes, it's a good one, but it alone isn't going to do anything. You need to do more. And it doesn't need to be protesting. It doesn't need to be setting cars on fire. You can just educate yourself, and that will solidify in your mind what you think and what is right and what is good. The truth will always win out over lies if you investigate and dig deep enough. Try not to be, now especially is not the best time to just be reading the headlines of things. Read the context and understand the context and get more context if it doesn't seem right to you. Because it will not only allow you to grow in your understanding of the issues and the challenges that people are facing, but it also means that you are armed and capable when you are confronted by other people who are saying things that are probably not exactly true or skew in a certain way that doesn't align with the movements that are going on and the issues that are being raised. It arms you with what you need to be able to counter those, hopefully in a polite and conductive and cordial way. But if not, then stay safe and do what you can. But I think educating yourself is a step that you can take, and it doesn't necessarily cost anything. It might take a bit of time, but educating yourself is a big thing that you can do. If you're just going to post black square on Twitter and then never do anything about that, or never invest anything in that, it's a bit of a wasted opportunity, I think. I don't necessarily agree that everyone that posts a black square is just like virtue signaling, but if you've done that and then haven't done anything else, I'm sure most people listening have made some effort and it's almost inescapable, this kind of stuff, but I'm sure they've all made some effort to find out what's actually going on. And, I'm sure that I'm not talking to the right people, but I just feel like education is a big thing that can be done. It's for people who feel helpless. That's a thing that you can do. You can educate just yourself and it will make a difference.
Yeah. There's not many opportunities when there's kind of this much momentum behind a unified cause. I found that, and I almost blamed the situation. I was like, what are the demands of the protesters? Like, this problem seems nebulous. It's hard to kind of encapsulate in one thing. If it's the kinds of, I saw similar things with Extinction Rebellion and environmental causes are often difficult to unify with one voice, because it's so many things. It might be like, well, we should be polluting less, but we should be transitioning to green energy, and we should stop killing whales, but we should also look after the Galapagos turtles. Throw out your plastic straws. Like, it's kind of, there's a lot of things there. But when there is enough momentum, like we're seeing now, then, and if you do exactly what Rod's suggesting, which is educate yourself, you don't blame the cause for not having a united message. It's up to you as a person to go and read the context and read the long articles. And, a long article these days is about 6 minutes of reading. That's not too much. And find the avenues that will keep you interested to get with. For me, a lot of issues get refracted through sport for me, and that can be really useful to kind of find a way into a thing and to find some footing with a topic or an issue, and then you can use that to kind of as your jumping off point and find the things that those same authors are writing about and find who they admire or who they like to speak about and go and read their stuff or watch their stuff or listen to their stuff, whatever it is. So go and educate yourself, and you'll find that there are lots of parts to this movement now, and that are worth supporting. And as I said, that the flywheel is moving quite fast now. So I think any action you can take right now is actually going to count for more, because there's a high chance it will be amplified and that it will make impact. You need to capitalize as a society. We need to capitalize on opportunities like this, where the whole world's attention is on one thing for a certain period of time, and that they're the times when real change is affected. I saw like massive protests in Amsterdam, and you're like, Amsterdam, amazing. Like that's not. I didn't think it's not like you don't think that Amsterdam has a voice or pays attention to world events, but like it's kind of far removed from what's happening in the US. But what's happening in the US is not US specific. Systematic racism is not US specific. It happens everywhere, and there's a local cause to fight for here as well. So yeah, take your time and take a breath and really dig into the detail.
The same thing was happening in New Zealand. And at first I was like, I don't understand. This is all happening in the US. Why are there protests in New Zealand? But you realize that the cause and the amplification of the message is the catalyst for not just supporting the US movement, but also everything that's happening in New Zealand, like the militarization of the police. Like, yeah, it turns out that was a problem they were dealing with, and they didn't even realize until they started to protest, and all these cops are showing up with guns, and it's like, whoa, what is going on here? There's things that are... There's ways that this issue is being adopted and co-opted. Some of them are positive. Some of them are perhaps not as constructive as they could be. And that's another thing that I want to sort of maybe... And it's something I've been thinking about is the way that you get confronted with an issue like this, but you can quickly and easily get distracted, and those avenues are not always... necessarily helpful or productive in any way. And in a lot of ways, then it becomes easier to excuse them or ignore them because you think, well, I dealt with that. Thinking about that issue led me to a different issue, and then I already had a predefined position on that. So yeah, case closed. That is how we end up being as complacent as we are and how things don't change. I've also been thinking about things like needing to challenge what you think is true versus the reality of the situation. Because I know even just your attitude towards the police, what you think of them. My dad's generation, he would be young and he would go out and, get drunk or whatever, and the cops would pick him up and put him in the car, take him home and say, tell your dad what you did. I don't want to catch you doing that again. And then that was it. And he thought the cops were great. He thought they were the best people ever. And then when he heard about, they arrested this Aboriginal person or they arrested this black person or whatever, his assumption was, well, gee, I got off scot-free. That guy must have done something real bad. This assumption that, especially if you're protesting, that the police are there to protect you is over and over and over and over again being proven false. And that's going to make people uncomfortable, but that's also, sadly, kind of the reality.
Yeah, especially at a time when we're being asked, especially in the UK and in Australia as well, to differing degrees of success by the authorities and by the government to trust in their decisions. And we're seeing in what in other circumstances would be quite authoritarian behaviour, like lockdowns and those kinds of things, that we can agree in most quarters especially, I talk about Australia because it's been relatively successful in Australia and again in New Zealand as well. But as a society, we will go, okay, no, we do happen to agree with the government on this, that lockdown will work, and there's scientific evidence of that. So we're all going to most of us are going to abide by those rules, right? And it makes sense for the people who don't to be punished. But there are circumstances, and we're seeing them now, where if you're left with no option, if the government or the authority or the authorities are doing a thing that doesn't make any sense, or that is unfair, or only looks after a certain part of society, especially a privileged part of society, and if that same government doesn't give you, isn't going to let you use the tools that are there, like peacefully protesting, or voting, or all of these kinds of normal tools that a democratic society would use to fight against a government or the authorities, then you have to find other ways. You kind of have to live outside the playbook a little bit there, and that's been difficult for me to try to understand and try to reconcile, because I'm not usually a troublemaker, not anymore. So it's, being able to understand why things like rioting happens and why protests don't stay peaceful because, violence is being met with violence, or that, as you said, that a lot of these, especially in the US, a lot of this kind of the fight against these protests that's not recognizably police. They look like the military, or they're armed in ways that I wouldn't necessarily think of, like a London bobby walking down the street with his little hat on and no gun and just being, checking on how things are going. The kinds of police I see around your sporting events in the UK that they're not wearing riot gear, and they're not kind of, they're helpful, but that's not necessarily, that's all context, and that's all circumstance, and that's all my privilege too, so it might take you a little bit of time to understand why people are, so energetically protesting. I don't like calling it rioting because I don't think that's everybody, and I don't think that's necessarily what it is, but, kind of trying their best to use every means possible to have their voices heard and have their demands heard. I think you have to, take the time to understand how it's gotten to this point, because that's a symptom of how bad the problem is, not just how loudly people want to be heard. That was just, again, another personal reflection on how I've had to kind of, learn about what's appropriate and what the appropriate response is, and what my response to somebody else's appropriate responses are. Because I think that whilst this might just seem like an eruption of a lot of pain and anger in the US, that's not the case. It's every day for so many parts of our society, and that it's been condensed into one movement for now, but this is not something that, when it starts to die down, is just going to kind of dissipate. The momentum is there for us to kind of capitalize on. Again, I'll come back to that same point, that this is a unique point that we need to make as much impact as we can. And I just can't get over how unifying it's been. I suppose in our lifetimes, it feels like there's been a lot of, especially with the internet and social media, people can kind of get up for a cause for a day or two, and everybody will do a thing.
Yeah.
And then it kind of disappears. But this doesn't seem to be disappearing, and with good reason.
No, absolutely not. And it's early. It's still fresh. We're still living through it. But I really think that George Floyd's name will kind of live as one of those big names, like Rodney King, or one of those people who is that era, all of those riots, or all of those clashes, all of the confrontation of the power systems that we have built in order to protect us. It turns out they weren't protecting all of us equally, and the injustice of that was recognized by everybody. But his name will probably be the one that, in a year or 10 years or 20 years, people, that name will be the signifier for this whole situation that's going on. And I think also, really would double down on your comment about, just challenging your own privilege and your privileged perspective, and thinking I don't understand I don't understand where these people are coming from, because when I walk down the street, the cops smile at me, they give me a nod, and everything's great. But you just got to understand that that's not what happens when you don't look the way you do, or when you, it's all right for you to walk through a shop without having security follow you, but maybe other people are treated like that when they're not doing anything. And we're seeing tons and tons of examples of people being attacked unprovoked during these protests and demonstrations by the police, completely unprovoked, sprayed, shot with rubber bullets. It doesn't matter if you're press apparently anymore, you're still going to get arrested, shot, sprayed. It's bad. It's a bad scene. And yeah, the power structures that are there that you may have a specific opinion on, that needs to just be recognized as history, or, only one perspective that isn't well-rounded and could be more, viewed more holistically, and that may unveil a different side of the picture that you've never seen before, and that's okay. And don't, it's not about blaming anyone for not having that sight or not having investigated things that weren't on their radar before. I'm just not about shaming anyone or blaming anyone for not being aware of any of this kind of stuff. But now is the time. If you weren't sure when the time was, it's today.
Yeah. You're responsible for your own education in this circumstance. It's not up to anybody else to do it, especially if you're an adult. I mean, which you are. You're listening to this podcast. You're a grown-up. You can. It's your responsibility now to, to fight against injustice and corrupt systems, and to educate yourself and donate where you can. And, I just as you said, spend the whole weekend reading about it, and I'm having trouble focusing at work because you kind of, there's this. I personally, and I know a lot of people I know, have been kind of conditioned recently with the pandemic to kind of be hooked to that news cycle a bit. Everyday news updates, everyday news conferences. You follow it on Twitter, Instagram, hopefully not Facebook, but I'm sure people are. And whatever news outlets you follow. And because of that, it can be really overwhelming. But one of the things that really jumped out at me was that how quickly in the US the local governments and states and federal government has moved to things like lockdowns and curfews because of their perceived immediate threat or a challenge to the status quo that they don't agree with. Whereas how amazingly quickly those things could be moved into force when the pandemic that was kind of it was difficult to place blame on anybody or to nail down to one single group or problem or enemy, I suppose, that those lockdowns that would have been useful in that time, those curfews that would have actually made the spread of the virus less. So they prevaricated and they ummed and they weren't sure and they didn't look at they didn't listen to scientists, whatever it was. It just stands in such stark contrast that these are really deep, systematically racist problems. And that's not specific to the US, but I mean, it's being highlighted in the US. And it seems to be the one we're all learning more and more about now. But that's really sticking with me. I'm having a long, it's almost like a bit of doublethink, like 1984 style. Like I'm having to hold these two ideas in my mind. It's like, in one case, the government's saying it's really, really, really difficult to make societal change that they can enforce and enact for the good of everyone. And yet on a racially motivated and politicized issue, they can immediately get to work and coordinate themselves and take stark horrible action in these circumstances, but at least take action nonetheless. Yeah. And that just feels corrupt to me.
Yeah, it's really problematic. I'm not saying that there's any simple solution. I'm not saying that things will be, immeasurably better on the other side of this. I'm not saying any of that because that may not be the case. But I mean, the debate is happening now. The conversation is happening now. So don't let this moment go past and look back on it in 5 years' time and think, man, when I was in the heat of it, I really wish I'd done something, anything. If you are feeling that way now, do it now. Don't resist. Don't hold back. Zach, maybe we should talk some F1 eventually. Don't know how.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, why don't we can. I mean, it's interesting because it's you look to the sport that you love or the things that you love and you go, well, how are they doing stuff? And Lewis Hamilton did an incredible job of calling everybody out on it. It's like, I'm sick of being the only person in this sport, it feels like, and it's quite obviously so, that is in this position and that talks about it. Where are the manufacturers? Where are my fellow drivers? Where are the other people in the sport? And, that's a message that I know rings true for you and I, as in that I agree with that sentiment, and it's something we've talked about with the sport in the past. It's lack of diversity, whether that's race, whether that's gender, whether that's sexuality, any of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
The sport is pretty one color, one sexuality. Like it's pretty bad in Formula One, and it's again kind of an issue that maybe we should be talking about we should definitely be talking about far more often than we are, and in maybe times of when the sport isn't normal, these are the opportunities to talk about it. And it might have been lax of me personally not to have taken opportunities to talk about it in the past, and it shouldn't be up to Lewis Hamilton to call out everybody quite rightfully and be like, where are your voices? And I don't know, how did you feel about the fact that when he did that, suddenly all of the other drivers on the grid were like, yes, you're right, we should support your voice and the voices of others?
I mean, some of them said that they felt a bit unsure whether they could do it. Again, I'm kind of... People can have their own opinion. My opinion is I don't want to shame people for not speaking out soon enough or whatever, but I think the fact that people perhaps felt that it wasn't their place to speak out that's also part of the problem. That's also a symptom of the problem. And I mean, obviously you can address that by ramping up the diversity as much as you can, the diversity of the grid, the diversity of people who work in the teams, to the point where it just becomes bleedingly obvious to everybody that, hey, this is an issue that probably might not affect me, but it's affecting someone close to me. Because if you don't have anyone close to you that it's affecting, it's easier to step back and say, well, that's not me. That's not... Someone else can speak up about that, but that's not me. Obviously, it affects Lewis Hamilton the most, but that doesn't mean he always has to be the first or speak the loudest. There's all kinds of spin-off issues for that. But before we get to those ones, I did want to talk about things like anyone that says like Lewis Hamilton shouldn't be outspoken about this issue. He should just stick to driving. I think in the context of having spent 4 months talking about something like the pandemic, to not also then spend any time talking about this I think there's a mismatch of realities there. We spent 4 months talking about a pandemic. This event, this unrest, this acknowledgement of injustice affects the US, it affects the world. We're going to be hopefully running F1 events in the US hopefully soon. And like I said, this issue is spreading across the world as well. So this is going to impact things. It just is. So, I don't think it's right to say, well, hang on, why are you guys talking about, why are we, or why drivers, why anyone talking about this issue? And it's like, well, we talk about issues that are not F1 all the time that affect it. That's kind of unavoidable. But then, I mean, the problem, I think, is that with Lewis Hamilton speaking up, and then there's the people who tell Lewis Hamilton, stick to driving, no one asked for your opinion on this. That's a problematic position to hold, in my opinion. But like I said, out of context, it doesn't really make sense. We talk about other things all the time. But then that generates a different conversation. And that generates a conversation of, well, should sports people be making it political or not? And then it's, again, this is the slippery slope away from the core issue that it's easy to fall into. Suddenly. You suddenly get distracted. Now you're not thinking at all anymore about Black Lives Matter or anything like that. You're thinking about, should sports people be outspoken politically or not? Should they take, I don't think this is an extreme view to say I support Black Lives Matter and I want to fight for correcting injustice. That's not even a radical position, but it's certainly been perceived by some to be like, attention seeking, virtue signaling, all those kind of negative barbs that people throw at someone who wants to talk about big issues where it isn't maybe what they're known for doing normally. Again, it becomes a distraction issue. And then, I don't know.
No, sport doesn't exist in a box. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't talk about all the positives of sport and all of the unicating. Like I always talk about endlessly probably too much. I talk about the unifying nature of Formula One on the world. It's this world-class sport that has a worldwide viewership, that has this incredibly diverse audience, that is, and it's a sport that goes around the world. It's really one of the few sports that is actually like that. And we can't talk about, the way that cities bring the sport to their cities, and the way that like Melbourne always justifies having a race is like, but it's so good for the economy and so good for the brand of Australia to get out into the world and to kind of push positive Australian values. We'll be like, well, that's sport being involved in the community and being involved in dialogue about politics and the economy and all these kinds of things. So no, sport doesn't exist in a box of just like Lewis Hamilton should stick to driving. You can't pick and choose the topics that you want your, sports idols or the people that you follow to talk about. You can't just say, okay, well, I just want them to talk about the things that I care about. And as soon as they don't talk about something I care about or that I think is worthwhile, then they should stick to the sport. That really frustrates me. And again, it just distracts you from the topic at large. No, sport doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is a powerful political, tool for discourse.
It certainly can be.
And it's used all the time for nefarious means. It's used by, Russia's been accused, and I tend to agree. My opinion is that there are countries that use sport, and especially Formula One, to sport wash their countries and to make it seem okay that, we host a Formula One race. Don't look at all of our political atrocities.
We're the same as the US. Exactly. We're the same as Australia. We're the same as Britain. We have F1 too. How bad can we be?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, we have to be really careful of that. And, when people speak up, you should always try to listen. And yeah, let's get, I steered us right back onto the topic. But I mean, that's
what we're here to do.
Yeah. And we can talk about, now that Formula One is back, it should be used. And I say it is back. Basically, the way we're saying that it is back is because Formula One announced the first, 8 races? And that's about as many as you thought that they would be able to do this year. So we'll see if they get them done.
They haven't happened yet.
No, exactly.
Away from the first one.
Oh, man. And it is, you thought, it was kind of hard to kind of follow along with the news and stuff, all that now. All sport seems to be coming back in a very vigorous manner. And it's going to be full on, and it's going to be really full on for those involved in Formula One, because it is essentially 2 triple headers and then a couple of other random races thrown in between.
It's 7 races. No, 6 weeks and 7 races, something like that. Some weird.
Yeah.
Oh boy, we're going to be busy. And the big problem with what's been announced is that this still only really covers one continent. So people are saying, well, wait a second, there's 8 races. Boom, we've got a championship. Unfortunately, they need to have both 8 races minimum and cover 3 continents. They've only covered 1. So I'm sure that's why they
I didn't know that.
Let's have double races. Let's have triple races, because who knows whether, Silverstone gets cancelled. Who knows whether other races down that are already committed to as part of that 8, some of them might get cancelled. So where we have the chance to run 2, let's run 2. Let's just get the numbers in. And then hopefully we can run one in, Japan. Hopefully we can run one in Canada or Brazil or wherever, and spread it out across the continents, because that needs to be done as well. So yeah, I'm sure that they are stacking in the races with the knowledge that, hey, that country right now might be okay, but it may not be okay in 3 or 4 months. There might be an outbreak within the F1 paddock that we can't contain. Who knows what's going to happen? Nothing's done until it's done.
It's going to be so interesting, I think, to see these races back to back. Because we so rarely get the opportunity to compare performances that way. You can only ever really compare the performance of let's say Kimi Räikkönen's great at driving at Spa, and it's there were different circumstances every single year of his career about which car he was in, how the group was placed, what the weather was like. The races that are back to back, they're only separated by 7 days, and look, we might get some differing weather. Of course, but it is kind of the height of summer, but when these races are happening, so it should be relatively consistent, especially in Austria, Hungary, the UK, these kinds of places. Be. I say that with a massive caveat, of course the weather can change. But as far as there won't be much development at a team level between those 2 races, so, the cars should be pretty much exactly the same, the drivers should be in exactly the same, frame of mind, essentially, barring any massively extreme circumstances. He says that again, there aren't, of course there are, but it should create a really interesting comparison. And I wonder if teams will, if they don't perform well, they'll be able to use that, 2 practice sessions, qualifying in a race, as all data to inform the race again in 6 or 7 days' time.
Yeah, well, someone who will be licking their lips, especially, is Max Verstappen, who always drives very well in Austria, has a good record there, and wouldn't you know, as luck would have it, there's a double header to kick off the season, so he may actually go into race 3. There's a real chance that he may go into race 3 with a championship lead, which is pretty incredible, I think.
Bonkers.
He will be hot to trot and raring to go. The other thing that someone pointed out about having double races back-to-back at the same track, obviously the debate that's sort of kicking around is this, well, yeah, you can almost take the result from the first race and you could almost pencil it in for the second race, because that's, whoever is doing well at that track, they probably will have worked it out by the second race and only embed their advantage, if they have an advantage at that track. And obviously the sort of discussion has been around, well, is this an opportunity to do something different? Should we try something different? Should we be trying reverse grid qualifying, where we race one weekend, the next weekend we have a sprint race where we reverse the grid. If you won on the Sunday the week before, you're going to start at the back, and then we do a 1 hour race, and that sets qualifying for the next Sunday, and then so on. All these sort of experiments are being thrown up in the air, and I'm not especially into the whole reverse grid idea of the stuff, but the question mark is around, what can we do when there's 2 races in a row at the same track to stop it from being so boring? So this is, I'm putting it on your shoulders. Everyone's looking to you, Zach, for answers. Please deliver.
Yeah, I think that they should just, we should do the first race, obviously should just be the teams and the drivers in their correct team cars. But then I'd like to see everybody pick a name out of a hat, and that's the team they race for in the second race. So the cars, it's the same person. All the points are still given to the people, right? But the second race has no manufacturer's points against it. So then it's like, how good are you in a different car? That's, so we can really get a gauge of how much, because that would be a great, it's fantasy, but it would be a great way to see how much the car is impacting the performance and the driver is impacting the performance.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that.
The other thing I like about that, and I put this forward back when Formula E started, and it was in amongst the heat of the Rosberg-Hamilton battle, is if a race was for driver points but no team points, all of a sudden team orders are out the window. That might lead to some more interesting racing, especially when 2 cars are evenly matched. They're not just going to follow each other. They may actually try and overtake each other. So I think that idea that you came up with, but I'm co-opting as mine, is also another potential way that we could spice up the racing. The other thing that I've been saying forever and never happens is we've got to change the tires. We have to incentivize people to try a different strategy, going on to soft tires and potentially doing 2 stints on softs instead of the classic boring one-stop races. So I would say race 1, let's try whatever tires you want to normally bring to that race. That's fine. Do it. Race 2 at that track, let's give drivers, maybe 1 or 2 steps in the softer direction, if that's appropriate for that track. Do that and just see if anyone takes that gamble and says, you know what, I'm going to come in and put on what used to be, the Ultra Mega Super Splendorous soft tires. I'm going to put in 10 of the fastest laps you have ever friggin' seen, and then make up that difference by doing 2 stints on those tires.
Yeah, I'd love to see the learnings from one weekend applied to the next, at least to be able to be like, okay, shit. Yeah, we at Pirelli got the tyre specification kind of wrong for this track. It turned out we needed to be, a kind of grade firmer on the tyres. They were dying too quickly. Like, let's grade everything up a little bit, and change those tyres up so that the racing will be more interesting next week. Because, other than rain, the conditions should be relatively similar. Then obviously a bit more rubber on the track because they've just had a Formula 1 race there and nothing else has happened. So it should be extra grippy the next race. But yeah, as far as like reverse grids and stuff go, that would all work fine if the grid was more even. I don't think it, like, so what, you put Ferrari and Mercedes at the back and we see what this happens, because it happens all the time. Every race weekend, one of the top 6 somehow fucks up qualifying and has to start from way down the field. So, and you see what happens, unless you're Valtteri Bottas, or Pierre Gasly. Generally, they fight through the field and they end up, currently, the problem is they end up like fifth or higher every time. So yeah, it would really only make sense to kind of reverse things if it was like half the grid, that like if you won the race, maybe you start from 10th. Like it's more of a handicap scenario as opposed to a like full reverse the grid. Like you start a little bit further back this time because you're obviously good here. But how do you account for like all of the other things that come up where people get crashed into and it's not their fault that they didn't finish, and so that just means they get to start at the front next time? Maybe they caused the incident, and so next race they start from pole because they drove into people off the start last time and took themselves out of contention. Like it's too many variables. So
You're running outside the points, you just decide to retire the car and you'll finish last, and then you start at the front the next time. It's just it introduces too many incentives to do dumb stuff, and I just feel like monkeying around too much and making things really gimmicky is just not a good look, especially when we need the sport to look its best. We need to be at the top of our game right now because all eyes are on whatever sport comes back, and if it's a shit show or a sideshow, it's not going to be any good. The other issue that's come up recently, which I don't think we've really even talked about, but since we're just sort of shooting the shit in a freestyling kind of way, is this thing that they're bringing in with testing, where they will say they will introduce graded testing, essentially a bit like if you start at the top, you'll get less opportunities for testing. If you finish down the bottom, you will get more opportunities for testing. What do you think about that? Do you think it's going to make a difference, or is it just a token thing, or what do you think?
I think it's, classic Formula One coming up with really difficult to understand and complex solutions to problems that are on the face of them pretty simple. This is part of the changes of bringing in a lower spend cap for Formula One. They're looking at things like driver salary caps, team size. That there was specifically the grading of like how much wind tunnel time you get. And that's a constant bugbear of smaller teams that they don't have their own wind tunnel, or they only have one. Whereas Mercedes, like, we got 17 wind tunnels, mate. We got wind tunnels you don't even know about. They're hidden underground. We're running wind tunnel stuff all the time, and we got supercomputers running simulations of wind tunnels. So yeah, I think that's a nice way to balance things out. That if we're essentially saying that because you did really well last season, you're further ahead of the competition, so we're giving the opportunity for the teams that are further behind to catch up through all of these other metrics. Now, it's not like we're saying, like, you won, so you don't get to do any development next year or any testing, or you don't get any wind tunnel time. It's more like you only get, like, 85% of the wind tunnel time of the total 100%, whereas the team that came last gets all of that wind tunnel time, which is, I think that's exactly the kind of solution that Formula One would come up with, spreadsheet, macros, tables, all that kind of stuff. But it's not easy for a fan to understand. And maybe that is okay. Maybe it is just like, maybe there should be all this behind the scenes, like leveling of the playing field, that as someone who just wants to watch qualifying and racing and follow the sport on and off, or even closely, doesn't need to know all of that stuff. They just want to see, should we be focusing on the solution and not the problem? And the solution is, we just want closer racing. And so whatever you need to do to get the racing more competitive, I'm kind of in for that.
Yeah, they're working on that, and obviously they've been talking a big game for a couple of years, and it's all coming to fruition, not next year, but the year after. But hopefully that will lead to some closer racing. And like you said before, that brings into contention other things, like perhaps maybe if some weird circumstance allows, let's try a reverse grid. It only makes sense if cars can still, if they're faster, pull up behind someone else and make an overtake. There's a couple of other, I guess, top-level stories that are now, not old, but they're, I guess, they came out after our last episode, but they've been around for a little while. But let's just maybe cover off them a little bit quickly. First of all, was Renault committing to sticking around? There was a question mark over Renault, especially in the coming years, because they had contracts that extended until the change of regulations, and then there was a bit of a question mark about, like, Daniel Ricciardo's there and he's leaving. Maybe he's heard whispers from somewhere that might be shaky ground that he's on with Renault, but they've committed to sticking around. Any reaction to that one?
Yeah, they said they were going to stick around, but they don't like Formula One as it currently stands.
Well, it's true.
The French government is adding a big bailout to French car manufacturers, and then they've got a specific, I think it's a €5 billion bailout for Renault planned specifically as well. So it's not like manufacturers are in a good spot right now at all.
No.
And the example with France is that they're tying those bailouts to becoming greener companies. So bringing more electric and hybrid cars to the market. So you can only get that bailout money if you make systematic change to the way you manufacture and the types of cars that you sell. The interesting thing, as far as I understand it, is that because Renault is already partly state-owned, they're going to be exempt to a lot of those same problems to give Renault a bit of a competitive edge, and look, that's a very basic understanding of the situation, but that's why Renault has a specific bailout for it, because the government already owns some of it. So, but it's all tied together. That Formula One might find itself in a difficult position ongoing with the way it kind of tries to exist in this bubble of but don't worry about all that environmental stuff. That doesn't affect us at all. When we've heard, all that. Look at Audi. They pulled out of WEC and endurance racing to go into Formula E because they felt like it was a better fit for their brand. Because they don't want to be seen as like petrol guzzling muscle cars. They want to be seen as like a technology and forward-looking futures company. I mean, how long will it be until Mercedes is also like, you know what? Maybe this doesn't suit our brand anymore. And there's all kinds of pressures on Renault. If the results aren't coming, then maybe there'll be all of those other smaller reasons to maybe not be in Formula One become a little bit louder. It's the same for Red Bull. They're not there to lose. They're there as a marketing arm for an energy drink. So if you're not winning, why would you be there? So so all these other problems start to come out for teams. And if there's lots of them all at once, they tend to compound on each other. They can't be treated separately.
Totally agree. The other big news was Williams. First, they announced that they were splitting from title partner Rocket, and then they announced, by the way, if anyone wants to buy the team, that's fine with us. They're looking for a whole bunch of different investment opportunities. If that means you want to give them money and pay them to stick around and run the team, they're open to that. Of course, who wouldn't be? But if someone wants to come along with a big sack of money to bail them out of the huge problems that they're in and say, we're very sorry, but you'll have to leave and let us take over, that is on the table as well, apparently. So this is kind of an interesting one. It would really be the end of a dynasty if Williams is sold completely and then kind of changed. You can't imagine someone buying the team and still calling it Williams. Kind of, McLaren has stuck around for a long time, even though their founder is long gone. But it would seem that the most likely thing would be some kind of a takeover. Yeah, and we've seen so many of them in F1 where you could trace back lineages of teams and say, that team, well, they bought that team, and then that team was only around because they bought that other team, and then you could trace it back, 30 years sometimes. But Williams in potentially, I don't want to say they're in trouble. Obviously, they've been in trouble for a little while financially, but also on the track. But a solution of some description could be on its way. Yeah,
I mean, it's too little too late. There was a time when Lance Stroll could have bought that team. That the way that Stroll has kind of taken over Force India turned it into Racing Point. They're also installed. There's been a changeover in the way in who's running Aston Martin. So Aston Martin has a new CEO, and Aston Martin's approach to racing and sponsorship is going to change as part of that same conglomerate, that the kind of investment group that Lance Stroll used to buy Racing Point. To buy Force India and turn it into Racing Point. That all could have come about like a year earlier or 2 years earlier at Williams if Williams had put their hand up and said, hey, maybe we'd like to sell. So it's literally the worst time possible to sell a Formula One team, right? There's no economy to rely on. Its sponsorship opportunity is
money. No one's going to races even. Yeah,
exactly. You don't know how the sport is going to look. So imagine trying to sell. I mean, it's probably partly why Rocket pulled out, right? Without that being blamed as the specific reason, I wouldn't imagine now would be a great time to buy a Formula One team with its future kind of unknown. So. I mean, it's happening in lots of sports with private ownership. So, I wonder if funnily enough, and this is total speculation, that we might end up with a bit of sport washing in the purchase of Williams. It's a storied brand with a storied history that's well respected, at least broadly, not recently as much. That maybe we get some Saudi or Middle Eastern ownership, or some Russian ownership, or something else, some outside of the UK ownership, which is nothing new to Formula One. But
wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah, exactly. Who do you want to buy it, Rod? Who would you have buy Williams right now if you were just to decide?
Well, if you're thinking about someone with a broken reputation that needs to repair it, and this is topical, Pepe the Frog would come along and buy Williams, rebrand it.
Yeah. Oh, bright green team back on the grid. Ooh.
Bad. Like that brand badly needs to be reclaimed because the original creator had nothing to do with how it's being used these days.
What about Toto Wolff?
Yeah, I was going to say, last one that I'll leave you on is the future of maybe Toto Wolff and Sebastian Vettel as a 2-for-1. Toto Wolff out of contract, but also reportedly considering other options. Now, this is a classic tactic that you pull when you want to get more money out of someone who wants you to stay. But obviously, he's got offers of joining the boards of big companies, and he might want to go and run and do something else. He might want to go and go away and then come back and run Aston Martin or who knows what. There's all sorts of options for him, and he's a man with lots of fingers in lots of pies, so he can kind of do anything. But the suggestion is that he might want to step back from F1. So I don't necessarily think the next move for him is to be like he is now, the big player or even a bigger player somewhere else down the grid. That doesn't really make sense to me. But he might be looking at his options, and that may have an effect for Mercedes. Similarly, even though I don't think this is going to happen, reportedly, talks between Renault and Valtteri Bottas have triggered, speculation, as wild as it is, that maybe Mercedes are having another look at Sebastian Vettel in maybe a bit more of a serious way. So, what do you make of all of that chatter?
It's murky, real murky.
It is. Murky,
it's
like what you did there.
It's totes murky. I could see why they would want Sebastian Vettel in the team. I think he'd be interesting for their brand. And maybe Lewis is like, I'd bait Sebastian Vettel, no trouble. Or maybe Lewis has been like, I don't want to be here long term, and maybe it would be good to have Sebastian Vettel there just for like 5 more years, just there doing an okay job.
Obviously, one idea that's been floated is that Liberty might say to Mercedes, "Look, we will pay you quite a substantial amount of money to keep him because we do not want to lose his story, as in one of those great young drivers that came onto the scene and was instantly successful, won a heap of championships. We don't want to see that leave the sport. It's also a pretty good narrative if you think about Lewis and Seb, obviously Lewis has pulled ahead now, but for a while they were on the same number of championships, and it was going to be a race between those two to the most number of championships. I don't think that Lewis wants Sebastian as a teammate, but having said that, I'm sure if you asked him, he would say he doesn't care and he will race any motherfucker that he has to, that he will probably beat. That would be his answer, I'm sure. Maybe with a few asterisks where I just read the letters, but yeah. So look, if Lewis doesn't care, if Mercedes benefit in terms of brand and money, the sport benefits, that's all of a sudden, I still don't think that's going to happen, but all of a sudden that's looking somewhat more plausible.
Yeah, everything is out the window, I would say, at this point. If you told me that Toto Wolff and Sebastian Vettel were getting together to buy...
Up is down, left is right, and don't believe history.
Yeah, it's all over the shop. I have no idea, how it's going to go. I would love to see Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel at Mercedes. I'm not lying. The problem we've had is that Mercedes has been basically untouchable for living memory, it feels like, for recent memory. And maybe the only way to bring them down is to send Sebastian Vettel and his crashiness and also sometimes brilliance into that team to unsettle Lewis Hamilton, and maybe they'll just fight. And Carlos Sainz Jr. will win it. Will win the World Championship in 2021. I know it's.
You heard it here first. We're on the bandwagon. It's coming home to Spain. Well, yeah. Look, I feel like that's kind of. That's what have we covered? Black Lives Matters, the world sucks, and F1. We're kind of done. We're out of topics.
Yeah. I'm out of topics. There's nothing else. I feel like we had a full and frank discussion at the start, and then we got into some Formula One stuff, which is a nice distraction. Thank you for sticking with it this far, listeners. If you've come this far, I hope that this show and other podcasts that you're listening to and other media you're taking in are both illuminating, but also entertaining and a distraction for you as well, because it fucking sucks right now. And my life only sucks a little bit in comparison to what many, many, many other people are having to go through all the time, especially now. So, I'm just trying to be thankful for the things that I have. And one of the things I do have is chatting to you, Rod, and this platform as well. So I'm really thankful for both of those. And it was really nice to just this feels like when we started the show. It was just talk about the thing for a while until we run out of things to say. And that's okay sometimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I said before, it's kind of hard to talk about some of these things, with work friends. That's not appropriate. And then, you probably live with someone that you agree with politically. So that's kind of also like, it's a bit, or not an echo chamber, but it's also a little bit like, kind of not actually making progress. We're just kind of agreeing with each other in not a blind way, but like in a, we're not actually, there's no substance to this. It's just sort of, we are so simpatico in our views that it's like nothing, like telling no one. So putting it out there feels better, and it means all the things that I've been carrying around for the last few days, I've probably feel are lifted a little bit, and that's a good thing. So by all means, if anyone wants to reach out to us because we've raised something that they're like, I just want to talk to someone about that, I just don't have anyone to talk to about that, please feel free. Send us a tweet if you want to do it publicly. You can, or send us an email if you don't want to do it publicly. Twitter at Superlicense. There's a Facebook group as well called Superlicense Universe if you want to jump into that, or email us, especially superlicencepodcast@gmail.com. That's both plugs, but also a genuine offer. If there's something that you just need to talk about anything that we've talked about today, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to engage with you. That's what we're here for. That's kind of what this is all about and why we did it in the first place. Maybe, Zach, maybe one last thing, if there's anything else that you want to bring up before I maybe get into this last thing that I wanted to cover. No,
I'm really excited to have Formula One back. It's going to be a welcome, unifying point for all of us.
You're going to be excited for a little while,
I didn't know how I was going to feel when they announced that it was probably coming back, but I'm genuinely getting excited now. I'm looking forward to sitting on the couch with a beer and some chocolate and some chips and just enjoying, even though it's behind closed doors, as much as you can have closed doors at a Formula One circuit, I don't think you can. And there's been much questioning around whether, whilst they're racing, will the doors be closed, or they'll need to open the doors to get people in. Anyway, I'm just glad to have it back, Rod. I'm glad that we can talk about the thing again, as opposed to everything around the thing. We'll actually be able to talk about the thing, which is nice.
I think don't worry about that. I think if you usually have snacks, get your snacks ready. If you usually have an alcoholic adult beverage, get that ready as well. It won't matter a jot that there's no one in the stands while you're watching on TV. It will still be just as good. Maybe the Monza podium won't be as colourful as usual, but when those 5 lights light up and then go off, no one's going to be thinking about any of that. I said to Zach, his hair went down. I said to Zach, we're playing this song at the end of the episode, and you said no, and I said bad luck. No, none of that happened. Sometimes, though...
You really put me in a position there.
Sometimes, though, in life, but also even in this podcast in the past, there have been moments where it's hard to talk about things. Think of, like, Jules Bianchi in particular. And somehow just putting some music out there can sometimes just express what you can't always express. And this song came to mind for me. I've been... for a side project I'm working on, been really invested in investigating some music, and this song came on my radar recently, which is just so pertinent that I thought it would be a great way to end the show. The song is called Hell You Talking About, as in, who you talking about? But it's, How You Talking About, and it's written by Janelle Monáe. I first heard of it through the cover that David Byrne does in his live show, but the song is about, it's a protest song. It's about black people who have died at the hands of the police, and it is about remembering them, reclaiming their name, not letting them become a statistic or de-identified or depersonified, keeping them in your mind, keeping you focused, all those things we talked about before, staying focused on what you need to stay focused on, remembering the real victims, remembering what's important, not getting distracted. The song doesn't give you any avenues where you can get distracted, or it doesn't put forward any argument. It is simply just a few words and then the names of people, black people who have been killed basically by the police. So I want to go out on that. It's hopefully something that will stick with you. It's also the kind of song that's written in the way that, sadly, could be updated in future with new people's names, and I'm sure there'll be some new names coming up as that song is played in future. And, you know, just to speak about how long this issue's been around, this song was written 6 or 7 years ago, so it's more timely than ever, but at the same time, it's been sadly relevant for far too long. But I feel like this is just a fitting way to go out. It encapsulates our view on these issues, and hopefully will keep things in people's thoughts and minds for a little while.
Say his name.